Hello and welcome to today's Crossing Borders, the IMC streaming service created to keep investment migration professionals connected and informed. Before we start, I just want to remind you that if you haven't seen one of these broadcasts before, you can catch up through our YouTube channel, give us a rating, and don't forget to hit like, share, and subscribe for updates. I'm Bruno Lécuyer, the Chief Executive of the IMC. To keep you engaged, we'll have some polling during today's sessions too. And to test this out, you should be seeing a poll on your screen, which I'm going to launch now. We'll give you 5 seconds to answer or stop at an 80% response rate. We're just asking where you guys watching from today. Okay, I think I can close that with 92% in Europe and 8% in Asia. So let me just close this. Please remember that you can ask questions using the widget on the top right of your screen, where you'll also find some useful handouts regarding today's discussion and some information regarding IMC initiatives. So let's start with the shock announcements from Ireland and Portugal in these past weeks and a joint declaration from 5 Caribbean prime ministers following a conclave with the United States government. There is a lot of uncertainty in the market and misinformation flying about social channels on what are essentially highly successful migration pathways. In this episode of Crossing Borders, we welcome Nadine Goldfoot, Managing Partner of Fragomen UK and IMC board member, Eric Major, Chief Executive of Latitude, Patricia Casaburi, Managing Director of Global Citizen Solutions, Oriol Molas, Founder and Managing Partner of Orience in Barcelona, Marion Suite, CEO of World Grenada Inc, and Troy Hanley, Managing Director at Henley and Partners, to share their analysis and opinions of the situation. I want to start straight with you, Nadine. What do you think caused the recent series of actions by governments to terminate investor migration routes around Europe?
Thanks, Bruno. Hi, everybody. I can hear an echo. Anyone else hear echo?
Voice is echoing.
Voice is echoing, yeah.
Okay, we'll see what we can do about that. Oh, it seems to have resolved itself. Well, thanks, everybody, and hi. I think there are actually a variety of factors at play here, all really influenced by geopolitical and economic events. And while some of these decisions seem quite reactive and abrupt, I actually think many have been a long time coming. We saw the closure of Tier 1 investor route in the UK last year, and this was the reasoning for this was to flow the sum of money coming from Russia into the UK that had not been subject to the appropriate checks and controls. But the reality is any investor application since 2014 and 15 had to go through the due diligence process of any regulated bank in the UK prior to applying for their Tier 1 investor visa. And so we have to assume that the decision by the UK government to close Tier 1 investor route really was political posturing. But we must bear in mind that the crisis in Ukraine gave the government a legitimate platform in which to make that final decision. But there had been a lot of pressure on the government for many years prior to that to close the pathway for the investor route. And it's only because of not following government protocol and legal process that they weren't successful in the past. More recently, we've seen, as Bruno described, the shock decision from Ireland, which came very abruptly without much notice. The official government line being that the investments were no longer considered necessary to improve the Irish economy in the way they had done in 2012 when the route was launched. Having spoken to a number of people in Ireland over the past few weeks to try and get a sense of what the unofficial view was, and there seems to be a consensus that a lot of it's been driven by a lot of applications coming from China and not having sufficient governance and mentoring of the actual monitoring, of the actual investments by the Bank of Ireland, and so the bank was getting increasingly nervous, which is not unsurprising given the current banking situation. That was then very closely followed by Portugal. Official line there being given that the increase in real estate costs was pricing local residents out the market, but I'm sure Patricia's going to tell us a lot more about that. I think in all these decisions, we really can't underestimate the influence of the EU at play here. Many of these decisions have been influenced, at least in part, by the EU, by the OECD, and other intergovernmental organizations who've taken a very public stance against investment migration, fearing, in my opinion, incorrectly, that it's a vehicle for money laundering and tax evasion. So I think we have to take all these factors into account when we look at what the current situation is and then how we move forward.
Bruno, you're on mute.
Patricia, specifically down to you in Lisbon, in Portugal, looking at your home country, can you explain a little bit more detail what is the current situation with the Portuguese programme following the abrupt announcements by your Prime Minister?
Yeah, so we had some indication back in November during the World Summit that they're looking at the kind of relevance of the Golden Visa program and that it could potentially have served its purpose. And then the government put together like a group of people to analyze the impact of the Golden Visa. So we knew something was coming. We're supposed to have known the findings of said appointed group by the end of this quarter. But then in February, there was a big press conference to address the housing issues in Portugal. And then somehow they found it, fitting to include the Golden Visa legislation into the mix. It was, again, very unhelpful the way that it was framed. They looked at future applications. They also put in the mix some investors that had already bought residential property that would then be conditioned on renewals. The user properties will have to be revisited and be put to like normal rental market. So this have been very badly received, of course, both by like public opinion and investors generally, or Golden Visa and stakeholders in the market. At that time of the press conference, they've opened up for like about a month of public discussions, and then in the end they got shortened and now it's been extended. There's a lot of like key people from developers, law firms, constitutional lawyers, basically the markets come together, and politicians from both opposition parties and government members in the Azores and Madeira. They've been very, very they've been clear about their stance and how they think this will not actually at all address the housing problem. It's a numbers game in terms, if you look at number of Golden Visa applications in the past 10 years, it's a drop in the ocean in relation to transactions. Obviously there are other programs. The Golden Visa, the Portuguese Golden Visa, it's been successful, yes, but there are other programs that came about around the same time that also contributed to a lot of inflow of foreigners. There's also the point of digital nomads moving here. So all of this is never like one isolated factor. So what we're seeing, it's a lot of movement in the market. The government now is waiting for the municipality to give their overall opinion on what's happening on their residential markets to see if it makes sense. This will happen actually this coming Friday. The government, which has a majority, will reconvene on the 30th of March, and hopefully we'll have a little bit of clarity as to what their intention is to put forward to a vote in Parliament. But there was a lot of the legislation, the draft proposed legislation, there's a lot of problems with legitimacy and some, legal principles. So we think this is going to be an ever evolving. But what we are seeing, which is super positive for investors, is that the government has already softened the speech. They are already saying that yes, maybe there's some other options on the table that will make more sense. So we'll see. We're fairly confident that we'll have either repagination or some rebranding, or at least a very suitable transitional period for people that are kind of on the process. But it's ever evolving.
Thank you. Before I move on to you, Oriol, in Barcelona, one thing that struck out from what you've said to me is regarding the municipal governments. Now, my understanding is that they have quite some way in politics in Portugal. So are they now in full gear lobbying the governments as to the benefits? Because to me, it seems that they are the ones who stand to lose the most. Because of the job creation, the ongoing job creation that occurs under golden visas. I've visited, sort of construction sites. I've seen hotels, operational hotels, which are often in the 4 to 5 star category, employing hundreds of people in the areas of hospitality, improving the tourism product that both Lisbon and particularly Porto have to offer against their Mediterranean counterparts. How pivotal will the municipal governments be in this debate?
Oh, they definitely carry a lot of weight, their findings. And I think there's a couple of things that are very good to be on record. The whole of last year, so they had already fairly recently changed the legislation, and it was, and the housing bill was meant to kind of avoid speculation in prices, particularly in Lisbon and Porto. And for over a year now, there cannot be golden visa investments in the residential market in such cities and some other kind of major destinations in Portugal. So all of the golden visa investment that has happened in this past 15 months or so, they have been going through commercial or tourism destinations in kind of main cities, or they are kind of turned completely to rehabilitations on kind of more low density or smaller destinations. So the impact for the country in terms of, like you said, in the tourism, it's years to come. We're talking employment on the actual, now is obviously construction and developers and stamp duty and taxes that go, into it. But you have the exploration that will generate a lot of jobs. We have some developers, for instance, that their project alone is worth more than the budgets for certain cities. So it is, I think, like, again, if it's not, and I think going a little bit onto what Nadine said, there's obviously always other political motivations behind it, because in terms of, if you look at logic, it makes absolutely no sense, because you can gear the investment in different ways if they want to have approved projects. There's so many ideas, or even get investors to put accommodation for accessible housing, which is the main topic and purpose of this bill. But I think there's always other things at play, like Nadine mentioned.
Thank you. We've seen that a lot, right? Politics trumps logic. But I want to bring in the poll question, and thank you, because that moves us on quite nicely onto that. We're asking, which one of the following 4 options do you think was the dominant reason for the Portuguese government deciding to end its golden visa? So you're seeing the results live. Wow, overwhelming number of respondents think pressure from the EU, the rise in housing prices at 8%, CEF just can't cope with the demand, national security and AML risks posed by the programme, but 67% think there's pressure from the EU. I think I want to bring you in, Oriol. You're based in Barcelona, neighbour to Portugal, of course. What are you hearing from your government about its own golden visa route? Can we expect any announcements soon, or is it just business as usual?
Hello, Bruno. Right now we don't expect any announcement by the government. This year in Spain, in December, we expect to have elections. There was a doubt whether the elections would be at the beginning of the next year, but it seems that the elections will be in December. That means that nothing that gets approved before September can pass during this legislation, and that would mean also that any major change that would come should start from zero from the next legislation. And right now, the agenda of the government is completely full. It has 4 major laws to pass before elections, including the new housing law, and there is no expectation of any announcement on from the government. It is also true that first thing, Spain is not an isolated country. It's still in the EU. So if there's pressure from the EU, we are all vigilant on that and looking on what's happening closely. And also it's true that there was a minor party that, and I think it was on all the headlines, that submitted a change on or a proposal on a change on the golden visa law to eliminate the real estate route. But again, it is a minor party, and it needs to pass through Congress, through the Senate, and that's a quite long process. That if the government really doesn't want to push it, it's very difficult that it happens before September. It's so that we will know if the government allows the debate to happen in the Congress by April, but we don't expect that it has time to pass before September. And if we take a look on what's happened or in the last months, we've actually approved, or there was a new law approved back in December. That was the startup law that makes the process quite easier for getting the golden visa. Makes also that the first authorization is longer. Instead of 2 years, it's going to be 3 years now, and also passed the new digital nomad visa that we also expect that is going to be a hit for this year. It's going to start from April. But again, we don't expect any announcement on the golden visa from the government in the short run.
All right, but can I ask you? I mean, Spain's had a program for a number of years. As you know, it gets some changes. Why do you think your Spanish program has perhaps not been as successful as Portugal and Greece? And do you think that now could change given the imminent closure of Portugal?
Well, yes, I think that it's true that we've had very successful programs close to our close to us, no? And I think it hasn't been so popular because it was not as easy to market as especially Portugal with this rehabilitation option at 280,000 and 350. Spain has been a real estate play where investors would come to Spain and look for. It was much tougher, especially for agents all around the world that have clients and want to send them to or sell them something that is quite, let's say, easy to explain to their clients. And obviously that I think Portugal did much better than Spain on that. But it's true also that lately some developers are also creating this kind of products here in Spain. We actually market one for commercial spaces. And I think that if we, given that the market is already offering these proposals to agents, and also that obviously there are changes on the neighbors, the demand can come to Spain.
Bring me some water, please.
All right. Okay. Thank you for those thoughts, Oriol. I want to go back to the poll and you, Eric Major. You voted also, presumably. Which of the four options do you think was the dominant reason for the Portuguese government deciding to end its golden visa? And I also want to have your thoughts on Ireland. Is it, job done for the Irish program? Has it achieved what it set out to achieve?
Yeah, thank you, Bruno, for inviting me, and welcome to my esteemed panel guests. Good to see you all. I was surprised by the overwhelming majority of your participants voting aligned with my own view, which I do think the European Commission and the European Union as a whole has weighed very, very heavily on this whole question of Portugal. But also, let's face it, it's been a really difficult ride the last 18 months. Let's look at what we lost. We lost the Tier 1 investor visa. Montenegro, I would argue, also by way of the pressure of the European Union, did not renew or extend. We lost Ireland with a blink of the eye. We had no clue Ireland was going down this path. If anything, we thought it was going to be reinvigorated, if I'm honest. So that was a surprise, as was the Tier 1 investor 15 months ago. And then the less shocking, we knew it was coming, but Portugal now cementing its position, and we'll find out exactly what the final proposals and provisions allow in terms of any final deadlines. Bulgaria was pressured out. Albania was about to launch, but is not going to launch. So make no mistake about it, the European Union is weighing in on these golden visa and simply doesn't like it for all the reasons we could discuss over another panel discussion. So that is, for me as well, the predominant reason. Yes, it's couched in Portugal with the rise of housing and the pressure pricing out the locals. And we had that debate in Canada as well, with the immigrant investor program in Canada pressuring, bringing pricing pressure in Toronto and in Vancouver, with wealthy Asians coming to buy our real estate in Canada at the time. Yeah. So déjà vu from my perspective. I think it solved the problem, if I'm honest, with CEF as well. CEF was not able to cope, nor was able to cope Canada, nor is able to cope, frankly, the EB5 in the US. So it solved a little few problems here politically on the housing side, CEF being out of its depth to manage it. The AML question was lurking always behind this, but make no mistake about it, it was the pressure from the European Union. What does that mean? With Ireland, you were asking me, is that, will that resurface? I think all of these programs have a potential, and Patricia was commenting how maybe could it have a rebirth in another form, another brand, a number of different variations. I wouldn't exclude the possibility that some of these countries who've closed the valve would reopen the valve, particularly as the effects of COVID still are being digested through the financial system, let alone the banking challenges that we're currently seeing unravel before us. So I wouldn't discount the possibility for Portugal, for Ireland, to revisit these programs. Case in point, my homeland of Canada, Quebec, has always had the program, stopped it for a while, is poised to relaunch it in the next few weeks, largely because of economic impetus. And guess what? I just read last week that the good old Hong Kong capital investment entrance scheme is going to make a comeback. Well, let's not forget, Hong Kong had a very successful program post-SARS. They created because they wanted to reinvigorate the capital flows into the city, which had been decimated because of the SARS epidemic at the time. And guess what? Hong Kong's gone through a very challenging last few months, if not the last few years. Yes. And this is one of the policy measures that they're going to bring back. So I wouldn't discount the possibility, even in Europe, to seeing the traditional golden visas make a comeback, but not in the immediacy for the last two programs of Portugal and Ireland.
Yeah, thank you for those thoughts, Eric. And we'll talk a little bit about the future towards the end of this broadcast. And one of those topics will certainly be how the programs should adapt. They're essentially legal migration pathways. New pathways that come onto the market need to adapt and perhaps also need to meet the demands of regulators and legislators. And one of those is the residency requirement, which for the most part isn't addressed really at all. But in future programs, that could be addressed, which would sort of calm down some of the negative connotations that golden visas have. But we'll talk about the future a little bit later on. I wondered if Troy from Henley and Partners, are you still with us?
Yes, can you hear me okay?
We can. We can't see you, but Troy, I wanted to ask you, do you agree with your colleagues, and what is your opinion that are the main drivers for the recent closure and change of multiple investment migration programs that we've recently seen?
Thanks, Bruno. Yes, so I mean, following on from Eric, I thought Eric had a really good take on this, and I think ultimately this was the EU that was putting pressure on Ireland and Portugal. I would say that is part of a much broader kind of trend that we're seeing, which is a pushback against kind of a globalization, if you like, because you saw something similar happen in the UK. You're seeing changes in Australia, New Zealand, Canada. So it's not all in the EU's remit. So this kind of pushed back against the free movement of people and capital. We saw start in the era of Trump a few years ago. We saw it in Brexit, where immigration was one of the key things that people voted to leave the EU for. And even more recently, I think, with the invasion of the Ukraine, now there's the EU is really assessing the restrictions around very different immigration categories across the EU. So for me, it's a big trend, a move away from open borders and a bit of protectionist policies that we're seeing. That would be my addition to what Eric said. And added to that, I think I had actually a different vote on the poll. I voted for the housing crisis in Portugal. But for me, something that we're not acknowledging enough is the economic turbulence the world is going through. The fact that there is a cost of living crisis in Portugal, the fact that there is inflation in Portugal right now. To the average Portuguese family who can't pay for their rent, they can't afford to get on the housing ladder. If they are told by the media and politicians that it's because of this GRP program, of course they'll believe that. They will certainly want to do away with it as soon as they can, whether they're right or not.
Time will tell. Thank you for those thoughts, Troy. I want to now move the conversation over to the Caribbean and specifically the recent US Caribbean Roundtable, which resulted in an agreement on 6 CBI principles that the 5 citizenship by investment programs or countries that have in the East Caribbean have all come together and agreed to a common framework. Marion Suite in Grenada, a respected attorney in your country with a wealth of experience in dealing with immigration, not only investment migration. What's your analysis of these 6 principles, and how should Caribbean governments develop common policy towards investment migration and then respond to the so-called first world?
Well, the 6 points, pardon me about my voice this morning, but the 6 points was, I don't know if everybody knows, collective agreement on treatment of denials. That is not to process applications from persons whose applications have been denied in another CBI jurisdiction. Interviews, they want us to conduct interviews with applicants, whether virtual or in person. 3, additional checks. Each jurisdiction will run checks on each application with the financial intelligence unit of its respective country. Audit the program annually every 2 years in accordance with internationally accepted standards. Request law enforcement assistance to retrieve, revoke, or record passports. And 6, treatment of Russians and Belarusians, suspend processing of applications from these nationals from March 31st, 2023. Now, points 1, 2, and 3 and 5 were always part of our programs. We never would process, at least Grenada, I can say, unabashedly, never process applications from persons whose applications have been denied in another country. We didn't conduct interviews, but the due diligence unit, okay, the due diligence providers will check with the persons to make sure that they're real persons, that their identities match the documents, etc. And all the checks went through not only our financial intelligence unit, it went through a regional security system, collaboration with the region, US, UK, and the EU, as well as we would make checks with Interpol and all the international due diligence agencies. I agree with previous speakers. I agree with Eric and Troy that all of this smacks of a protectionist approach, and it's the same kind of attitude that we faced for those of us who were involved in offshore finance, you know, offshore companies, international business companies that operated offshore, etc. And that is the bottom line. That is the bottom line. And the whole question of treatment of Russians and Belarusians, that is coming out of the war with Ukraine, and that is obvious. The whole objective of both the US and the EU putting pressure on the rest of the world, it is clear that is a protectionist approach, coupled with dealing with Russia and Belarus with respect to their policies over the last 5-10 years, and which is magnified with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. There's no ifs and ands about it. And the fact of the world, it is not a level playing field, especially for the Caribbean. The only reason why even the EU granted us, agreed to grant us the visa-free access in the midst of us having these programs is what the programs did for the economy of our countries in the Caribbean, particularly the Eastern Caribbean. Yeah. Because you would note that the other countries do not have such programs. But on a point of note right here, I would point out that all countries in the Caribbean and in the so-called first world, US and Europe, etc., always had migration programs and investment programs of some type of the other.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Usually people will migrate with either a business visa, or they start off with a holiday visa, and then they will invest in the country and then go through the long process, first by attaining permanent residence and then attaining citizenship after the grant of the permanent residence. And that's what people do in the Caribbean. But now, because there is an available avenue for those who have deep pockets to do it in a fast-track way, you have people availing themselves of that program. What I have found interesting with the Grenada program, apart from the rush in the last 5 years of people from Russia and China and Belarus applying for applications, quite a few of the applications that I have done did not come from these individuals. The applications came from South Africa, which still has severe visa restrictions obtaining visas, and they were often people who were working in the oil industry and want to be able to work in the Black Sea, etc. Americans who were fed up with the politics, Europeans who were looking to protect inherited wealth because the tax structure in several countries, Italy, France, had changed so drastically, and people from the Middle East, again, because of visa restrictions.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So what you're saying, Marion, is that there's lots of different motivations for people to choose a Caribbean nationality. Some might well be that they actually want to move to the Caribbean and then set up their tax residency and live there for at least 180 days in the year. But for others, it could be a travel tool. Do you think there are legitimate concerns by the US government that should things go really bad in the world and suddenly 100,000 Chinese or Russians or Belarusians, move to Grenada or St. Kitts because they are citizens of that country, and the Eastern Caribbean isn't very far away from Florida, right? The east US coast. Do you think that's a legitimate concern, or is that just an excuse?
Well, I don't know that it is. What I find interesting is that our due diligence process goes through the CIA and the FBI. So it is not that they are not familiar with the applicants. Okay, these checks are run through their system, at least for Grenada. Grenada's due diligence procedure is so rigid and so strict. Yeah. Okay, it is not like some jurisdictions that have allowed people that did not pass through the due diligence process. I am not aware of any application that did not pass through the due diligence process. I mean, I would give an example. There was a case of one Chinese businessman who also had US residency, and then he fell afoul of persons in the US with his set of investment. And to date, we revoked his passport. But to date, the US has not revoked his permanent residence in the US. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay? He made international news. Okay? So I feel the approach is not only protectionist, but it is a manner, it is a method for maintaining hegemony over our region, control to some extent that people don't want to talk about, but it is a fact. But recognizing that the inequalities exist, what the Caribbean has agreed to do is to accede to the due diligence, extra layers of due diligence procedure. And right now, our government is looking at meeting the point. They have advised all the agents, both marketing agents and local agents. And this is one of the peculiar features of the Grenada program over everybody else. You have to pass through two types of licensed agents. So the first set is the marketing agent has to do some level of due diligence, and then again, then after that it passes on to the local agent, which is the liaison between for the client with the CBI unit. Okay, and our banks, because they wish to maintain its corresponding banking relationship, also does their own due diligence prior to accepting any funds for any application. Okay, so
Yeah.
that is a peculiarity.
Indeed, it is. And I just have to move along because there's certainly a lot to talk about on this. And looking at these 6 points, there's a lot of work for these governments and these CIU units to do in the next few months if there's going to be a rollout. A proper structured rollout of this agreement, particularly, as you say, in point 2 for the conducting of interviews with applicants. For the most part, that doesn't take place. The collective agreement on treatment of denials to make sure that all the 5 countries do share the information, because I know that not all the 5 countries are sharing the information with the GRCC.
Grenada does.
I know that Grenada does.
And the other territories have now agreed to share with us.
And then the big one
is now some reciprocity.
Is also audits, annual or biannual audits in accordance with internationally accepted standards. That we still need a lot of
Number 4, they are putting it in place. They are putting it in place, and Grenada has already put out to, and they're looking and they're interviewing suitably qualified persons to assist in this regard. So Grenada is ahead of that.
Fantastic. We definitely look forward to hearing an update on this, hopefully in May during the Investment Migration Forum, which this year is taking place between the 15th and 18th of May.
Yes, we're going to plug that advertisement plug. Yes.
I'd like to bring Nadine Goldfoot back into this. With all these changes and this agreement, do you think governments in the region can relaunch investment migration routes, taking into consideration this new agreement as such?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Bruno. And, I think there is a really valuable and important part to play for investment migration in many countries' economic and fiscal strategies and policies, whether it's in the Caribbean or Europe or elsewhere in the world. But we can't underestimate the impact of public and government perception, which, albeit often misguided and ill-informed, in the world we live in, perception is reality. So I think that particularly as we're going into the pressure being imposed by the US, as within Schengen and within the UK, we're moving to a situation with ETIAS and ETA, which is the equivalent of ESTA for those going into the US. So that is being driven by governance, by monitoring, by transparency, by compliance. So as we're moving into that environment, I do firmly believe all of these programs can be relaunched, but a lot of work can have to be done to satisfy the various authorities that these changes are being made. We know from Marion that's being done in practice, which is fantastic, but I think there's a bit of a PR exercise to be done to satisfy the relevant authorities that that is all definitely being done. And I think more broadly, particularly if we look at Europe, again, there was a really important part to be played for investment migration, but we have to look at what do these economies currently need. And personally, and this may sound a bit controversial, but I don't think the future is in passive or other than perhaps the Caribbean, in real estate-based investment, because that's not what the economies currently need. It made sense, following the 2008 finance crash and then the real estate crashes in those markets, but that's moved on now. And now if we look at what various economies around the world need, they need entrepreneurship, they need innovation, they need job creation. So I think the future of investment migration, beyond satisfying the authorities of the compliance piece, is looking at how they can actually satisfy immediate needs in the various economies. And we've touched upon digital nomads, but I think, and that's a whole nother topic in itself, but I think that's an important part to play here as well.
We have. Thank you for talking about the future. I want to bring Eric back into this and put a question to you. Do you think, in your view, that the Caribbean CBIs will lose visa-free travel over the next 2 years?
I want to make sure my mic is on. Yes. Well, that's a sensitive question for many in the industry. We're pondering this in light of what we saw happen with Portugal and Ireland, but also with the murmurs of both the European Union and now the United Kingdom, very publicly saying, the minister saying that they're reviewing this matter of visa-free travel from the Caribbean to the UK. So if I'm honest, I'm concerned by it. I think the probability of it is more than 50%. I hate to admit it, but I do think it's a real probability, despite the gathering of February of the 5 prime ministers and their CIU heads with the State Department, as well-intentioned as that is, and it did achieve some important milestones in terms of how these programs are administered in the future. I have no faith in the Americans taking steps towards the EU or the UK to not take a position on this question of visa-free travel. We've seen the EU do it with Vanuatu.
Yeah.
All the right reasons, right? Vanuatu was not doing what they were supposed to be doing when running these programs. Certainly not the case in the Caribbean, although, and I respect everything that Marion has said about Grenada, and Grenada is quite diligent, but we also know that there are some, there's always a loose, what is it, a loose link in often these chains. Some do it better than others. And I think that whilst these 6 guiding principles is a step in the right direction, some very basic things need to happen as well. Reporting the stats, how many people come in, how many people are withdrawn, how many people are refused. And the refusal rates, frankly, are not high enough. I know the risk that this industry has vis-a-vis citizenship by investment. And to me, it's got to be a double-digit refusal rate. And interviews could play a role in that. So I think that's, but as Nadine said, optics, unfortunately, has become reality. And I think the Caribbean has to, is coming together on this idea that we got to play the optics game and fess up to how we're positioning ourselves. There's still some work to be done.
Yeah, and I'm very optimistic that these 5 prime ministers did come together positively for this agreement. Well, I am conscious of the time. I know, Marion Suite, you've got something to add, and we'll come back to you. I want to launch the final poll for everybody. If I can get the tech right, launch, let's go. You should be seeing that on your screen. What we're asking now is we're looking towards the future, looking ahead. How do you think recent announcements and potential crackdowns on investment migration programs will affect the overall demand for such in Europe, particularly in the short term? So audience, it's over to you. And while those results are coming in, I want to come back to you, Oriol, in Barcelona. What, in your opinion, is the future of the Spanish RBI program? Very briefly, please, in less than 2 minutes.
Thank you, Bruno. Well, I would say that in the short run, the recent developments in Europe, especially what's happened in Portugal, and it has actually been happening already because of the delays that they were experiencing. The short run will be, we are facing an increase of demand. That's we are already seeing that because there's more people looking into Spain because of the recent developments in the countries surrounding us. However, as I said before, we are not an isolated country. We are in the EU, so if there's pressure on Portugal, there will be pressure on Spain in the future also. Despite we don't expect any, and we know that the program is protected for at least the next couple of years. The Spanish program will be linked to whatever the EU will decide in the in the future. It is also true that Spain is also wanting to promote residency visas and the non-rotative visas especially. We've passed a very interesting program now that is not only good for like high qualified high skilled professionals that can move to Spain and get a non-rotative visa, but also a very advantageous tax regime. And also, there's another thing that is also affecting a lot on the demand on Spain. That is what's been happening in Latin America in the last year, where a lot of the governments are turning to parties on the left. That means that a lot of, I'm just coming now from a tour on Latin America, and I can tell you there's a lot of demand to move to Spain somehow, either through investment or through other kind of firms. So I would say the demand is quite stable for us. High now because of the recent developments, and in the long run, we expect that at least the demand will still be there, because there are new markets coming in that have a very logical path to Spain.
That you're developing. Thank you, Oriol. And Troy in London, where do you see the most growth in the next 3 years?
Yes, so growth in the next few years, for me, it's definitely Africa. As it stands at the moment, we've still got a massive spike from US nationals. The reopening of China, that's really rebounded. But looking ahead, Africa has the most growth development possibility, I would say. Just if they can lift that multitude of people into a middle class, the welfare is going to explode. And I think the socioeconomic factors that push those nationals to getting second passports will be a bit stubborn and remain. So it's definitely Africa for me.
Thank you. Eric Major, in 3 years, we were going to try 5, but I just think 5 is just so long in the future, isn't it?
Yeah, 5 years, the crystal ball is very, very foggy. Even 3 years is a tough one. Bruno, you're right with the rate of change. It's maybe the investment side of the word migration will continue, but with emphasis with that appearing in other markets out of Asia, out of South America. Golden visas will spur up in South America, in Asia, and as we're seeing in the Middle East, Saudi, Oman, UAE has a program. So the investment side, the passive side, I agree with Nadine, is maybe more of these new markets entering into that foray, and that the old traditional Western markets are going to very much firmly move towards active, participatory, labor-linked type activity in the economy, and less the passive route. So for us at Latitude, it's expanding into these new markets that still look at these golden visas in the traditional sense, but in the more mature, established markets, the Western markets, it's moving towards startup visas. It's moving towards digital nomad. Yeah. It's moving towards non-lucrative visa, and moving towards even citizenship by descent. That's where we're expanding our net.
So a massive change in the traditional sense of what investment migration is, and everybody needs to get on board to adapt and evolve to be able to service these new clients and these new demands. Nadine, some final thoughts from you, please.
I think something that you said earlier, Bruno, I've been thinking about is if we were to readdress the physical presence requirement across a number of the jurisdictions, would that go some way to satisfy the authorities as to the legitimacy of these pathways? I think the biggest challenge we have actually is reconciling the perception that investor migrants are not fully integrated into societies and countries because it's not their main home, and because perhaps they don't spend majority of their time there. And I think our challenge as an industry going forward is to really work with policymakers and governments to understand that physical presence is not the solution to integration, particularly in the world we're living in, where it's technology-based, we're building relationships virtually, people want to be mobile. You can create integration through sharing skills, sharing talent, sharing expertise, without putting the onus upon the applicants of physical presence of over 6 months, a year and longer, because I just don't think that is going to be satisfactory to our client base in this market. So as we're asking governments to change and think about a new way of investment migration, I think this has to be a part of it to keep it attractive to our client base.
I think I've just thought of another new broadcast we can do, is on educating, one, the OECD, and two, the European Commission and Parliament in Brussels on modern day living, because the tax system is still very much fixed as it was 30, 40 years ago. And physical requirements, and that is what the tax system is based on. You spend your 180 days, well, you'll normally, you sort of become a tax resident in that country. But the past 4 years have shown us that, digital movements, nomads, that you can have links to a particular country without physically being present there 24/7. So I think that a lot of the policymakers need to be dragged into the 21st century. In my opinion. Patricia, some last thoughts from yourself in Lisbon.
Yeah, sure. I mean, just to pick out so much thread there to bring it together. I think we're going through a huge amount of brain drain, which is another factor that we haven't really considered here in this discussion. In reverse, you have a lot of Americans moving into Portugal, moving into Spain, like we're talking about digital nomads programs, which bring that kind of extra layer of involvement, even if it's for, just under a year, over a year. Portugal launched the digital nomad visa in October. Already over 200 have been issued. We've done about 30, but that comes a lot of sets of problems as well. I actually think digital nomads, they contribute a lot more for the rental housing crisis, for instance, that the government is trying to address than golden visas, for instance. We touched a little bit on tax and social security and how that, and yes, I agree that we need to harmonize, that we need to look at other ways of looking at tax and contributions and all of it, or global entry, or even harmonizing how these different residency programs, what kind of due diligence they're exposed to when we look at the traditional kind of citizenship by investment, super stringent diligence. There's no comparison. So there's a lot that we could do as an industry as well to try to harmonize, to show a new perspective, of a new way, and open up the world. But this feeling of protectionism, I think it comes, yes, from political perception, but it's also, capital loss and movement, which is a little bit scary. And the world has shifted so quickly from COVID. So I don't know, I agree with Eric that the digital nomad and the most kind of traditional residency programs, that would be a standalone streaming topic, because it is a little bit of the future, and that kind of people actively seeking all of it. A little bit on Nadine was talking about that real estate is not the answer. Possibly not. There's other ways that they're a little bit more productive, but we can't just kind of, unfortunately, it's not an easy answer, right? Isolate things. Yeah. There's a bit of a combination of it all. Like in Portugal, can tell you for certain that the housing crisis and price speculation, a lot of it, and it's something that they don't want to admit, but it's actually caused by Europeans. The biggest buyers in Portugal are actually French, and not golden visa buyers.
Yeah,
there's the NHR. So there's a lot of contributing factors. But
it's almost comical, isn't it? Because one of the founding pillars of the EU is freedom of movement. And obviously, French people moving to Portugal for better weather, cheaper accommodation, and a better lifestyle is affecting and is creating possibly a housing crisis, more so than 1,000 applicants from third countries. But of course, the EU cannot attack one of its fundamental pillars, freedom of movement. So politics again trumps reality, doesn't it? Thank you, Patricia. Marion Suite in Grenada, your final thoughts. What should the strategy for the Caribbean be in the short and medium term? And I know you put up your hand a little bit earlier on, so we'll finish with you.
Okay, well, one of the things I agree with Eric and Nadine that the Caribbean governments need to deal with all these people from the first world, the EU and the US, who are putting pressure with respect to the physical presence, because the world is changing. Even when you take the Caribbean, for instance, we have a number of people who live here for a large part of in the winter months because it's too bloody cold on yachts, and they actually work, online. And that is a group of people that we have been trying to encourage as well, because they use resources here and they pay for resources online. I think the Caribbean needs to look at migration and investment in a different light and couple it with the traditional foreign, direct foreign investment initiatives that we have in the past and we still have, and come up with a hybrid product if it were, okay? So as to satisfy not only our own requirements, but as well as the demands of the EU, the US, this first world, okay? And somebody raised it earlier to look at investment maybe in education in these countries, which is more palatable for the rest of the world in terms of receiving our programs. The concentration of investment only in either to government and infrastructure projects that we don't know about or in real estate is too limited.
Yeah.
Which brings me to another point. One of the problems with the Caribbean governments, there is not enough transparency as to its actual due diligence process. So I know about it, I tell you, but a lot of people don't know, including these people who are putting pressure on us. They don't, you're not transparent enough as to how the countries are employing the funds that they gain. IMF knows, and IMF in its report says CBI has been good for the Caribbean region because they pull them out of the debt. But who reads? The average person does not read an IMF report or World Bank report. So there needs to be more information, more competent, transparent information.
Definitely, and we've said this in the past, we've done some research on it, and we've said the Caribbean is a perfect poster child for sustainable development goals, and using investments from golden passports, from citizenship by investment into the 17 SDGs, and we identified about 6 that are directly relevant, and one of the big ones is of course addressing climate change into the future, which is a big challenge.
It'll reach that too, because that's the next thing, and we haven't addressed that, and we might need a whole seminar on that, but we also have to consider things like climate migration.
Exactly, which is a reality in Vanuatu. It's a reality in the Pacific, in
India and Pakistan. I had inquiries from India and Pakistan after the monsoons and saying we cannot live like this anymore. Can we? What? And they say even before citizenship program, can we get a permit to come and work there, work in the Caribbean? So
Mario Gutierrez, the UN Secretary General, made an impassioned plea yesterday across the news channels regarding climate change and how it really does need to be addressed. There are 300 million migrants roaming around the world in 2023. That number is likely to go up to 400 million in 2024. So we do need to find modern solutions which are adaptable to address the migration question. I want to thank all my guests today. Please feel free to reach out to Eric, Nadine, Oriol, Patricia, Troy, or Marion directly, all are members of the IMC, so you can look on our website for their contact details or through their LinkedIn profiles. You can find this entire broadcast on our YouTube channel in a couple of days' time. And whilst you are there looking at the back catalogue, please do me a small favour, but a valuable one, leaving us a rating and any comments that you may have. Crossing Borders will be back in April, just before the 2023 Investment Migration Forum. In the meantime, I wish you a good day ahead and thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone.